today. So first of all, welcome everyone. This is Azim Azar from Exponential View. These are a new series of Friday discussions that I'm going to be running. Fridays with Azim Azar, we're going to call them, I think. And I'm really excited to get that going. There's so much going on in the world of AI and infrastructure and investing and geopolitics that creating a space for us to talk about these issues, I think, is super important. And we will run these normally at 12 o'clock Eastern time, which is 9 a.m. Pacific time, 5 p.m. UK time. But our special guest today, Jeff Ding, is in the East Coast, and this is the time he could make. So this is the time I'm going to make. Jeff, thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Azim. Really glad to be here and looking forward to the discussion.
Well, I've been a big fan of your work on China and AI for a really long time. And you also just had a book published, I think, in the last 6 or 8 months, which was really interesting. And maybe we'll, in the show notes, we'll tell people about that. We're going to touch on some of those topics today. What I wanted us to talk about really is this notion that we've got this kind of breakthrough in Chinese AI, and the extent to which it actually could be quite helpful for the US economy, the global economy in general. But maybe let's get started with just a sort of sense of how has what DeepSeek did electrified the people in China?
Yeah, I think DeepSeek has been a tide-turning moment. The Financial Times recently had a piece come out that emphasized how so many state-owned enterprises, hospitals are rushing to adopt DeepSeek, not necessarily because it's improving productivity, but almost more of a publicity stunt to show that they're aligning with this Chinese champion in some sense. And so I think that gives you a signal of how much excitement there is over DeepSeek. I think I saw some statistics that the most popular LLM chat app used to be ByteDance's Doubao, and DeepSeek surpassed that within 2 months. So I think those are two pretty stark indicators of how much attention there has been on DeepSeek in China.
Alignment is a really powerful thing. So you have DeepSeek coming out as a Chinese champion, surprising everyone, even those who claim to say it's on the algorithmic improvement curve. And then you had the premier putting a lot of these tech company bosses at the sort of front of a very important meeting. And then you have the state-owned enterprises and local governments and big companies like Sinopec and PetroChina deploying DeepSeek, but also the private sector. I mean, I saw that Midea, which makes my air conditioners, my portable air conditioners, has put DeepSeek into their new range of air conditioners, which is, by the way, incredible product time. But there is this sense of alignment, like when you take a magnet and all the filings line up behind them. And that, to me, could create some momentum.
Yeah, I think it could create momentum, but how much does your air conditioner actually need AI integrated into that? Or I was reading some of these stories about doctors at hospitals saying this is more of a publicity stunt than it is actual integration.
Right.
No, I think excitement is great, hype is great, and part of, I think, one of the we can go back just a little bit in history in terms of China's AI development, and history is like just a couple of years in this space, where China released these draft generative AI services regulations. I think this was April 2023, and that actually imposed very stringent requirements on the forerunners to DeepSeek, like other Chinese competitors that were trying to open up their large language models to the general public. And those restrictions included things like, if you want to have public-facing services, you need to verify the objectivity and accuracy of your training data.
Right.
So
they were pretty stringent.
Yeah. So I think the reason why I emphasize that and why generating hype and demand is really important is uh, that's I think what was so special about DeepSeek is it let people see how good it was. And so after August 2023, those restrictions were relaxed.
Mm.
Fast forward to now with DeepSeek, now you can actually play around with it and see how it's thinking. That little feature of just showing the chain of thought reasoning,
Yeah.
really underrated. And yeah, so generating hype and demand is really important. But I think as we're going to go into, how do you actually see and measure this integration into improving productivity? That's the next step.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so I think you took us back, and so I think we should step back a little bit. So back in December 2024, I called DeepSeek's various breakthroughs a Sputnik moment, right? So this was before the panic in January, where the Sputnik moment reemerged. But I said it was a Sputnik moment and a wake up call for the US. Now, I think you and I reasonably see eye to eye on this. That the phrasing of uh, AI technology is as an arms race is unhelpful. It's probably I think you've got a great line for this, which is it's sort of damning on other arms races if this is really an arms race. And you have spent a lot of time to uh, uh, analyzing this in your book, Technology and the Rise of the Great Powers, which I will recommend to people who are watching this. Um, what I'd love to do is slightly unpick some of the assumptions behind how general purpose technologies, which I study and think about a lot, really make an impact in economies. Because your argument is that in reality, it's not about innovation. It's actually about diffusion and deployment of the technology. So it's not he who comes first, it's he who spreads it most widely or she who spreads it most widely. Um, and I think in the US, the assumption is amongst Anthropic, OpenAI, and others is you've just got to be the first and you've got to be the best at all times. So just kind of unpick that, right? Why do we get to this point where we say actually it's the diffusion that really matters?
Yeah, so I think first, as a caveat, there is some credence to the innovation first type of thinking. I think folks at Anthropic, at OpenAI, in the AI governance space, there are real and I think concerns that we should take seriously about transformative AI systems, artificial general intelligence, and who gets to that first. I think where I struggle with that is it's hard for me to picture. I think sometimes we picture artificial general intelligence as one day Anthropic opens up a box and we get AGI.
Right, like a great iPhone.
Yeah, and so I think it's important to understand those risks, and maybe there is a version um, where it is that sort of arms race where AGI is this super weapon, and it's really important for countries from that standpoint in terms of the geopolitical stakes. I think my book is trying to go back and say, what if AI isn't something that's completely different, and we can't just take it in a vacuum, and we look back at this reference class of general purpose technologies that you were talking about and you've written about. What can we learn from these past industrial revolutions and how they affected great power competition and the rise and fall of great powers? And from there, in all these past cases, innovation leadership is contested. The US is not the only one coming up with new computer and software innovations in the third industrial revolution. It's not the only one coming up with new electrical innovations in the second industrial revolution. And Britain is not the only one coming up with new iron machinery improvements in the first industrial revolution. There, the country that achieved technological leadership was the one that was able to adopt and spread these general purpose technologies throughout their entire economy. And the
Yeah.
key point here is productivity growth, because that's
Right.
one great power to sustain economic growth at higher rates than its rivals. And eventually
Yeah.
that economic leadership translates into geopolitical and military influence. So that's the angle I'm coming from. I'm not saying other angles aren't important, but this is the pathway that is borne out throughout history.
Yeah, I agree with that. And to add to some analysis there, if you look at when general purpose technologies actually had an impact on productivity growth, it follows an S curve. And in those early years, in the case of the steam engine, it was actually early decades. In the case of electricity, it was 3 decades from the first commercial power station running in Godalming in Surrey and in Pearl Street in New York in the early 1890s to the 1920s before you started to see productivity rise, because you need to distribute the technology far enough in to the economy for it to affect enough firms, for those firms to have time to change their processes, for new businesses up and downstream to emerge as complementary businesses for that
Yeah.
technology. And that's when you start to see the absolute growth of the benefits that the new technology brings to productivity. What's interesting, of course, it was 50 or 60 years with the steam engine. It was about 30 years for electricity. It was about 15 to 20 years for the PC. And it really does point to this argument that you make, which is that those first few years are not necessarily helpful unless they help a nation develop the capital markets, the capabilities that allow them to take advantage of the technology as it matures and as it gets sort of spread more widely into the economy.
Yeah, and I don't want to get us too in the weeds here, but I would be interested in how people date the emergence of a GPT, right? Because
Right.
I think for me, those dates might be the period of diffusion for a computer might be even longer. If
Mm-hmm.
you go back to like the first microcomputer as the start date, or
Right.
even AI. Like I would be curious to see what would you date as the arrival of AI as a GPT. For me, that's the AlexNet submission to the ImageNet competition in 2012. If you date it as 2023 with ChatGPT, then some of these numbers get a little bit wonky. But I think the key takeaway here is that general purpose technologies do take multiple decades to diffuse.
They take time, and they also but what they have in common is that it's the diffusion moment, which is when the productivity gains are realized. And I think there's a second detail here, which is that if you think about uh, I'll say this in a non-economic sense, but effectively, if you're already in a high productivity environment, it's really hard to get even higher productivity. If you're in a low productivity environment, the first few machines really transform your productivity. So the relative productivity growth that you get from a new technology can actually favor countries that have less advanced economies, because they've just got, it's just easier, right? It's easier to go from lifting 20 kilos or 30 pounds to lifting 50 pounds than it is to go from lifting 300 pounds to 500 pounds. Right. And that may, in some sense, favor China. So let's think about kind of diffusion, right? So if the diffusion thesis is correct, beyond the anecdote, what are the indicators that we would look at to try to understand whether the rate with which this is diffusing and whether diffusion is happening faster in China than in the US?
Yeah, it's hard to look at. It's hard to find good indicators in the moment, in the early stages. I'll point to a few things. So one is you could look at China's adoption rate of cloud computing and other digital technologies. And so I've done that in some research and shown that if you look at all these different information and communications technology adoption and readiness indicators, China's been relatively slow at diffusing some of these technologies throughout its entire economy as compared to some of the more advanced economies. And some of that is almost not too surprising. Wealthier countries oftentimes just diffuse technologies faster, especially ones that do require some capital investments and human capital investments. Uh, China, now that's not to say China hasn't had really impressive diffusion success stories with things like consumer facing apps, like mobile payments, delivery apps that we were just talking about at the beginning. And
Right.
also ones where you can coordinate from the top down, this sort of like infrastructure driven um, diffusion, like with high speed rail.
Mm-hmm.
But I think those first couple of indicators are a better reference class for AI, especially as we see how some of these large language models are being diffused through integration with cloud services.
Yeah.
The one that would be one that I'm paying closer attention to with respect to AI specific diffusion is how many companies use 1 billion tokens a day. And so this was the feature of a recent China AI newsletter where
Right.
1 billion tokens. Let me see if I have the specific thing.
So is this 1 billion tokens being served by a single API from a large language model, or is this an enterprise use case drawing on a billion?
Yeah,
It's the
enterprise,
latter.
an enterprise user that is using 1 billion
Yeah.
tokens a day.
I might actually fall into that category because I'm on these damn things the whole time. So maybe I'm a billion a day guy.
So
Okay,
that's
probably not that far.
for a conversational AI model. Obviously, tokens are going to differ based on what type of application
Yeah,
serves
yeah, I'm teasing.
conversation.
Yeah,
But for a conversational AI model, 1 billion tokens is about 1 million conversations.
yeah,
So you, I don't know if you're at that scale there, but so in China, at least on this report that I translated, that actually a contributor Lily Lee translated, there were about 200 companies that had
yeah,
surpassed the threshold. So it's
right.
kind of arbitrary, it's a round number, 1 billion token, but and that's going to vary across different applications. But those are the type of indicators I'd be very curious about.
Sure. I think that's a really helpful token indicator because, of course, the token is our atomic unit of machine intelligence right now. That's what we use. Tokens cost money for the company who is using them. Companies should theoretically be rational, so they should be making a margin on the tokens they're using, and that's quite indicative. That's really interesting. So that would actually say that at the very minimum, the biggest companies are using about 200 billion tokens a day in China, right? So that starts to give us a sense of at least that segment and how big the token market is. I wonder that that's an exercise we could think about for
Yeah,
the US as well. Yeah,
yeah, and I think that underscores like it's hard to track diffusion. It just takes an extra step with I think sometimes why we gravitate towards innovation first things is just the headlines are always made by what comes out, what's the latest and the greatest model,
right.
who's scoring the highest in all these different benchmarks, these chatbot arenas. It takes an extra step to be like, okay, we've got this anecdotal evidence of Chinese hospitals doing large language models for publicity stunts. Are they actually using the tokens? And then the next
Sure.
step, using it efficiently and productively.
Okay, I love that indicator. Now, unfortunately, you've got this spinning in my head, and I'm going to have to control my brain for the next 25 minutes, and you know, move on from that. But let's talk about the containment strategy. So, the US has had a pretty aggressive technology containment strategy towards China. It goes back to 2018 with Huawei going on the entity list, and then we had the big expansion of controls while Biden was president, and the ban on high end GPU exports, and on it goes. And I remember writing when this all started that the problem with this is that necessity is the mother of invention, and you have many cases in recent history in the last 30 or 40 years where export controls or bans have resulted in sort of new innovations emerging, because countries still need to get these things done. Then Ben Thompson, who's a sort of a wonderful analyst, wrote in his newsletter Stratechery a couple of weeks ago, pushing that idea even further. And he just said, these semiconductor export controls, this attempt to contain, is not working. It's actually unhelpful, and the US should stop doing it. Um, I mean, what's your take? I mean, do you think that the current containment ideas are working?
So I think the first cut at this answer is to try to figure out what is the US trying to achieve with its export control policy. And I think it's trying to achieve a bunch of things that aren't actually what the publicly stated rationale is. So the publicly
Right.
stated rationale for the export controls on the Federal Register is to slow down China's military modernization and human rights abuses using AI technology.
Mm-hmm.
You almost never hear those two in the discourse, right?
Right.
Former security advisor Jake Sullivan, he talks about we need to slow down China's development in frontier technologies. Or he's even said, I think like this technology is like magic, and that alludes to like the concerns about who develops artificial general intelligence first. So I think whether it's succeeding or not depends on what your scenario is. If you're, I think for a lot of people who think export controls are succeeding, their scenario of risk is we need to make sure the US develops artificial general intelligence, whatever that looks like first.
Right.
Or um, military applications of AI look like armies of who gets to an army of 1 million programmers who conduct unlimited cyber attacks, and that's their version of success, or that's their risk scenario that they're trying to prevent. For me, again, going back, history tells us these technologies, their most important impact comes through economic power as the vector first. And if
Mm-hmm.
that's the vector, it's really hard to make the case that these are succeeding because you're not going to prevent, you can't monopolize innovation in this space. And the race is really about who can diffuse AI at scale the fastest. And to diffuse AI, now we can get into the weeds of this too, but at least for my take is that the chips required to diffuse AI at scale and the inference scaling stuff don't necessarily need the chips that are being controlled under the export controls right now.
Yeah.
Now, I do want to touch on this necessity as the mother of invention.
Mm.
Um, I think if you read interviews from DeepSeek folks, the chip controls were certainly a constraint. Um, but I do take Ben's point and your point that I think there are historical examples that sanctions do backfire. Think about British naval blockades on Germany before World War One. Almost all of the world's nitrates, which are used in
Right.
explosives, came from Chile. So the
Mm-hmm.
naval blockade cut Germany off from organic nitrates, and so Germany developed synthetic nitrates.
Right.
Uh,
And we
eh,
got the Haber Bosch process from it, which
yeah,
has kept half of us alive on the planet.
yeah. So for me, I think people are too quick to discount the backfire effect, and it's
Mm-hmm.
not just that sort of backfiring effect. It's also in the long run, decades down the line, do you undercut Nvidia's dominance at some point by
Right.
spurring Chinese competitors? But that's how I would address the export control
Yeah.
debate.
Yeah. So I think that there are a couple of interesting challenges there. So one is that, of course, one thing the Chinese had in mind for many, many years was building their own semiconductor industry and getting to the sort of share of semiconductors that were bought in China up a much higher percentage being locally designed and locally manufactured. And that's why you had, investments in SMIC, and Huawei was doing what it was doing. And that process was taking time, right? Because there are these bottlenecks. One of the key bottlenecks, of course, being ASML and their EUV lasers, which they believe have got decades of advancement lead over anyone else. But there is the other point, which is how good does the technology need to be, and how good do the chips need to be, the infrastructure, in order to change the economic outcomes? And when I've gone out and talked to bosses around the world, and I've talked to people from some of the world's largest systems integrators who serve all the large companies, they've generally said GPT-4 is so good that even if nothing better comes out, we've got a decade's worth of work integrating this across our organization and for our clients. And of course, we've got GPT-4 even before DeepSeek came out with its sort of V3 and then R1, running on smartphones and Raspberry Pis and so on, right? And so in some sense as well, from the economic power argument, the the absorption capacity of a technology within an economy is a really important factor, right? Unless you get the magic of artificial superintelligence, which will suddenly make everything right and much faster and so on, until you get there, there is a rate, even if it's faster than electricity, even if it's faster than PCs, at which an economy can absorb a technology and start to yield those productivity benefits. And the thing that played in my mind was that, of course, I suspect that we are at that point where the technology is just really, really good enough. And even if there was a freeze frame of development now, you would still be able to yield the productivity enhancements, and it falls back to the deployment question. And so that was my lens. But then there was a third thing that showed up in the last 2 years, which is that, of course, if you're delivering 100 trillion tokens a day to enterprise customers and consumers, you got to run those things hot on GPUs, and those GPUs need cooling, and the GPUs and the cooling need power. And what we're hearing in the US is we haven't invested in our electrical grid for 20 years. And in fact, US electrical consumption has been flat, even as industry has moved to transport has moved towards EVs since 2004. I mean, it's 2 decades of it. The country adds about 30 to 50 gigawatts of capacity a year, which is about a tenth of what China does. So then there's also this other strange race condition, which is if you want to diffuse, because all of the use of GPUs is going to move in a diffusion scenario, not to training, which is what we tend to kind of focus on because these are such big machines, but to inference. And that's going to require, even in a high efficiency world, lots and lots of power. And it seems to me that the export controls don't, and the containment strategy doesn't fix the fact that the US hasn't got a method for adding power to its grid, but China does.
Yeah, I think so. Two things on that. One is, uh, I would take a I would take with a grain of salt all these projections of China increasing its computing center capacity. We've seen in the past that some of these computing centers are idle when people go and visit it. It's like an abandoned warehouse with overgrown weeds and stuff like that. But I take the point that energy and electricity is a huge underlying factor here. I think the the pushback I would give on that is we're uncertain. I'm always skeptical of people who can project 5 years down the line. This is the trajectory we're going to keep going down, because there's a world where diffusion actually doesn't happen mostly through centralized cloud computing, and that the
Mm-hmm.
AI happens more through like the computing power is more on the edge side. And so there, maybe the electricity demands are not as much, right? The whole premise of what Chinese companies like DeepSeek or Model Best are doing is, can you get the same capabilities of a 100+ billion parameter model with a 13 billion parameter model,
Mm-hmm.
right? Make those dense. Can you make models denser and squeeze a lot more out of a smaller parameter size model? And then the question is, can your end-side device, your iPhone or whatever, can it support a $7 billion parameter model to run for 2 hours
Mm-hmm.
in a day?
Mm-hmm.
And what type of chip do you need for that? That
Right.
might need a whole rewiring of the electrical grid. So I think I'm open to the fact that there's all these different types of diffusion pathways and might differ based on the particular application sector. So that's my one point of skepticism about all these projections of here's how much electricity we need to add to the grid, how much energy we need to add to the grid.
Yeah, I mean, I think people don't really know, and we should be pretty honest in recognizing that Google has changed their projections by 15 to 17x in a couple of years time in a couple of years, and the orders were not put in place. And the fact that these firms are spending $320 billion, the big tech firms in the US, on capex this year, but that number was a third of the size only a few years ago, tells you that people don't really know. This is a lagging system. There are lags and feedback loops, and there's going to be overcapacity and underutilization. And we also really don't know and can't project what demand is going to end up looking like rather than intent. So we had Sam Altman yesterday when he launched GPT 4.5 saying we've run out of GPUs, and there's two stories there, right? One is, wow, if OpenAI can't get enough, there must not be enough. But the second is that means the market is really uncertain because people are not responding to the fact you can sell a GPU for $100,000 and producing enough of them, right? So there's, yeah, I totally agree. There's a lot of uncertainty, but I think what is baked in is very very large commitments. And what the reason that those commitments are baked in right now is that in a way there's a kind of a bit of a standoff here. The first of the hyperscalers or the big tech to say, hey, I'm cutting in half my expectations, they're going to trigger panic first on their stock, then on the market. And so I think they found themselves all in the same boat for a little while, regardless. So I mean, I think the build out is going to happen, and I think that pressure on the US grid is going to continue, even if it's generated out of a sense of mutual fear.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So let me turn to the last thought here, right, which is like, we've talked a lot about what doesn't work, right? We've talked a lot about, that it's diffusion, not innovation, that containment hasn't worked. You're in Washington, you're a professor at the George Washington University. I understand there's some pretty important people who live in Washington. What would you advise the White House on their AI strategy if it's about diffusion and if containment isn't going to work?
Yeah, I think here in DC, I don't know if you've heard, but there's been some shakeups. I think honestly, a lot of my advice from the book still applies, but just given what's happening right now, for me, the advice is just damage control, right? Things like if you care about diffusing AI at scale, you need to train a wide body of AI engineers through a bunch of different pathways, including community colleges, and giving a lot of people different access pathways who wouldn't traditionally go into computer science or machine learning. So things like not abolishing the Department of Education might be a good starting point. And so some of it, to be honest, is damage control here. But yeah, the advice that I would give is, right now it seems like the U.S. is very much in a Fortress America type approach to the leakage of cutting edge innovations in AI, in terms of competing with China, and we should pivot more towards a run faster approach.
Right. Yeah.
And that means thinking through, okay, what are all these different diffusion pathways for AI, and how can the government step in where there are market failures? What are ways to get different parts of the science and technology ecosystem talking to each other? That's one of the biggest parts of diffusion, is just linkages between university and academia and small businesses. And so I can't example of like a public-private partnership program that supports internships in AI. So it's more low-key policies like that. Even with the Chips and Science Act, there was the CHIPS plank that was all about, we got to get domestic production of chips back in the US. But the most important and the diffusion relevant part of that was expanding the STEM workforce plank, the science plank. I'll give you one guess on which plank has been implemented and authorized, and
Of course. Yeah, and in China, I think it's 3.6 million STEM graduates per year, and it's 40% of all university degrees. And you also have a lot of deep tech talent returning from Western companies back to China. I think it's 7 times the rate of 2 decades ago, and even in volume, there's more peer-reviewed scientific articles coming out of Chinese faculty than out of American um, faculty. So there is this sense also that ideas really count, and what is the idea multiplier that exists at these moments when new technologies emerge into the market, because it's the multiplication of the idea that constructs the upstream and downstream complementary innovations. And it brought to mind this fantastic tweet I read yesterday from Andrei Burkov, Tweetle and he says, if it wasn't for DeepSeek, the big labs would still be feeding us incremental improvements on benchmarks, increasing by 1 percentage point, one after another, for 5 years. Now they've had to reveal all and they've had to give it for free. DeepSeek saved us 5 years. And it's quite interesting because it rather echoes what Mark Andreessen, who is an American investor at Andreessen Horowitz, has said. He said that the sort of open sourcing of this technology is a real gift, a sort of sense of thank you, DeepSeek. I mean, just thinking back in terms of your framework of diffusion versus innovation, how much do you align with that idea?
I think I think for me, uh, I think we shouldn't go so far in terms of the embrace of DeepSeek. We have to recognize that this is a technology that's trained on a censored data set, and has censorship baked into the model. I think there's a danger in terms of some sort of similar risks with TikTok in terms of how much influence should the US or the UK give to a platform that is going to that could tailor news or the presentation of facts in a way that's aligned with like a pro Chinese Communist Party mindset. So I think we should be careful on that front. There's been interesting like jailbreaks of the DeepSeek model to
Yeah,
make uncensored as well. I think that the point I'd make here is, I think the broader point here is that in a general purpose technology, you're always going to have breakthrough countries. With electricity, the Parsons steam turbine was the key breakthrough in terms of allowing cheap generation of electricity in utilities. Even though we think of Edison's light bulbs and all these U.S. innovations. And so I think on the broader point, I agree in that the U.S. could benefit a lot from innovations from other countries. And we see that in general, the U.S. productivity growth is driven in large part by innovations sourced from other countries. But
yeah.
in the details, I do think we need to pay more attention to these censorship risks.
Sure. Just as an aside for those people who are watching who are not familiar with the early history of the electricity industry, the Parsons steam turbine was invented by a British inventor just about the time that Edison was starting to build his first generators down in Pearl Street. So let's come back though to another question I wanted to ask actually, which was about the level of censorship in the model. So. Um, Obviously, if you use DeepSeek on the website, stuff is censored. If you download the distilled version and run it locally, as I have, you can get all sorts of quite spicy discussion about China, about things that may have happened in June 1989 in quite some detail, including some commentary that wouldn't look out of place in an American newspaper. And but of course, you have to go further than that. And I think that's what Perplexity, for example, has done. They've gone off and said, listen, we've gone off and retrained this and fine-tuned this model so that we have, got rid of this CCP influence. Doesn't that kind of solve this issue?
Yeah, um, I think partly for me, I'm a little bit out of my depth here in terms of I don't know what they did on the fine tune.
Right.
So yeah, I think it's great that these DeepSeek integrations are trying to address this issue. And I think Perplexity on their website also emphasizes sort of the data center security
Yeah.
aspect. as well. But yeah, that kind of surprised me. In one of my recent newsletters, there was this Chinese benchmarking organization that benchmarks large language models I've been following for years, and they released a report that showed 18 different deployments of DeepSeek on third-party services like Perplexity. And actually, it was the U.S. third-party deployments that were ranked as more stable and efficient and accurate. It was Perplexity, Poe, which is a subsidiary of Quora, and then I think Together AI, all based in California.
Right.
And so I thought
Absolutely.
striking. We kind of, the usual coverage is look at how fast China is taking advantage of DeepSeek, but when you go back and look at the data and the analysis of who's actually providing stable services and integrations based off of DeepSeek, it does seem like it's the Perplexities of the world that are thriving.
The devil is always in those details, right? And in the nuances, even in kind of big topics like this. So this has been a great chat, and there is so much more to say. And both of us are going to be writing about this for months, maybe perhaps even years to come. And let's just kind of finish off with I want to take your opinion on a few things very quickly. So kind of top of mind, overhyped or underhyped, self-driving cars.
I I'm like a political scientist, so I'll go just as a caveat. I'm not following all the investing trends, but I'll go overhyped.
You think they're overhyped? I thought that until I went in one, and I went in a Waymo, and I fell in love with them. I think that they certainly drive better than I do. What about deep research tools like Perplexities or Groks or OpenAI's? Overhyped or underhyped?
I haven't used them yet, but I'll say overhyped.
Jeff, you've got to use them, buddy. You've
I'm
got to use them.
you would think that I'm like up to date on all the technical trends, but I'm a bit curmudgeonly.
Do you think that there's a chance that a Chinese model will become the global leader on a major benchmark in the next 12 months or 18 months?
No.
No, still advantage with the US firms. And I would like, you are super well plugged in. So who would you say is going to be a really smart person who could join me on my next or a future Friday morning, Friday afternoon discussion?
There's so many. So I do all these recommendations, the newsletter. The one I just came across recently, Grace Shao has this AI Proem Substack where she does similar things, sort of deep translations of Chinese writings on AI related topics. So that's front of the mind right now. I think in terms of people who are doing deep thinking on U.S. China relations, I read everything by Alistair Ian Johnston, who's at Harvard's government department. And I think he has some really interesting ways of thinking about how China is trying to revise or not revise the international order.
Two amazing topics. Thank you so much for your time today. This has been great. I'll follow up with Grace Chow and with Alistair as well. Your Substack is China AI, substack.com, and mine, of course, is Exponential View. And hopefully, we'll get a chance to exchange ideas again in the near future. Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks for having me, Azim. Good to chat with you.
Cheers. Thank you.
Cheers.